The Revolutionary War, also known as the War for Independence, was fought between 1775 and 1783. It was a war that was fought between the British Empire and the American colonies. The ruler of Britain during this time was King George III, and he had previously given the colonies freedom to govern themselves and to have their own legislature. King George III also gave the colonies the protection of the British Empire and its famous Royal Navy. The 13 colonies started to get upset when in 1764 Britain imposed the Sugar Act, and then they imposed the Stamp Act a year later. Colonists were frustrated because Britain forced them to pay these taxes yet did not give them any representation in the British Parliament. Colonists rallied behind the phrase, "No taxation without representation." Colonists began to protest, but in 1767, Britain's Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed an even higher tax on items such as paper, glass, paint, and tea. The result was the reappearance of colonial aggressions, and this aggression resulted in drastic events such as the Boston Tea Party. Tensions continued to rise, so in 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, with representatives from 12 of the colonies. They decided that they would remain under British authority, but that they wanted the right to create their own laws and taxes without British input. Congress then banned most imported products from Britain, and Britain responded by sending the Redcoats, or their army, to the colonies. The colonies did not have an army. Because of this, small volunteer groups from the colonies formed militias for defense. On April 15, 1775, the war began. Britain's goal was to eliminate the rebellion of the colonies, and America's goal was to gain complete freedom and independence from Britain. When the Second Continental Congress met and decided to form the Continental Army, they selected George Washington, who had been a hero from the French and Indian War, to be the Army's general. Early in 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. Paine used his pamphlet to explain the wrongdoings of King George III, and he demanded for independence. After this, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to come up with resolutions for the colonies. They also requested that the colonies be renamed as the States. Important men in that committee were Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Thomas Jefferson wrote the document that was chosen to be law by Congress. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was in action. Of course, there were different types of people in the war. There were the Redcoats, the Patriots, Loyalists, and Neutralists. The Redcoats were the British Army. Patriots were fighting for freedom from Britain. Loyalists were those who still pledged allegiance to Britain, and Neutralists refused to fight for either cause. It's important to keep in mind that the Patriots were outnumbered. In the beginning, they didn't have an army, they did not have a navy, and they did not have factories to manufacture weapons or other supplies that they would need. But still, the Patriots fought for what they believed in. Many battles were fought in this war, but the Battle of Saratoga was the first great American victory and is widely believed to have been the turning point that led to America's triumph over Britain. After this great victory, France decided to ally with the United States. The winter of 1777 and 1778 is crucial to the history of this war. George Washington brought his troops to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the winter. Materials, food, and clothing were all running scarce, and a third of the soldiers were barefoot and starving. Although Valley Forge was never a battlefield, it claimed the lives of hundreds of American Revolutionary soldiers during that winter. Against all odds, the troops spent months being drilled and trained in military tactics, and by spring, they were a group of professional soldiers. The war continued and battles were fought, until Britain finally agreed to give America its independence in 1783. So what exactly happened during that cold winter that turned things around for the Patriot troops? And how did they get supplies to survive that harsh winter? Author Christiana Gregory answers these questions for us in her book, The Winter of Red Snow. This book is made of fictitious diary entries from an 11-year-old farm girl who discusses life in Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. Abigail Jane Stewart is an 11-year-old living a comfortable life in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania until one life-changing December morning. On that special morning, Abby and her sisters awaken to the sound of drums, signaling the Army's arrival to Valley Forge. Abby is shocked at the sight of the Army. While she was expecting strong and noble men to make up the Army, many of these soldiers were younger than her 15-year-old sister Elizabeth, and they walked on frozen, bleeding feet, some with no trousers, and others with arms bare in the freezing sleet. Throughout the rest of the book, Abby references bloody footprints in the snow to be a sign of the American Army. After the Army's arrival, the Stewart family and other neighbor families dedicate themselves to help provide for the needs of the Army as much as they could. Many important historical figures are referenced in this book. For example, the Stewart family befriends George and Martha Washington themselves. Abby's diary gives the readers an insight to the homes of Valley Forge farmers, the headquarters of George Washington and his officers, and into the tents of his soldiers. Abby sums up her experience with this quote, "I'm beginning to believe that unpleasant events often work together for good, like a coat of many colors." So what was it like to be a soldier at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778? What was it like to be an 11-year-old girl living in Valley Forge at that time? What hardships did the soldiers face? How were the soldiers strengthened and helped along the way? Who was George Washington as a person? Read The Winter of Red Snow to learn the courage, cowardice, charity, greed, life, and death events that Abigail Stewart observed during this changing point of the Revolutionary War.